Party parliamentary colleagues, legal experts on human rights, and representatives of the Iranian Resistance Movement, the NCRI. And we will be considering what the United Kingdom can and should be doing to support the global campaign for justice for the victims of the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in Iran. The 1988 massacre is often referred to as the world's worst crime since the Second World War, and is recognized by NGOs and some legal experts as an ongoing crime against humanity. In order to obtain a better understanding of the magnitude of human suffering it's caused, we've invited some family members of the victims and former political prisoners who have survived the mass executions to give us a first-hand account of their personal experiences today. Recent headline news on Iran concerns the UN Security Council's failure to extend the weapons embargo against the regime, and the issue of whether international sanctions should be reimposed on Tehran because of its breach of key restrictions contained in the nuclear deal, the JCPOA. These two issues, together with the alarming human rights situation in Iran, are matters of serious concern for the international community, including, of course, the United Kingdom. But I believe that we have now arrived at the moment where expressions of concern about the regime's unacceptable behavior are not a sustainable policy. For far too long, the regime in Iran has escaped accountability and acted unacceptably both within Iran itself and abroad. You don't need to be an expert or a politician or a diplomat to understand that allowing an oppressive theocratic regime that has on its record the mass execution of 30,000 political opponents and the sponsorship of international terrorism to buy weapons on the open market from equally oppressive regimes around the world will very probably end in disaster. The issue of accountability, and that means ending impunity for regime officials in Iran, is an important part of the process of stopping Tehran's malign regional activities and its pursuit of nuclear weapons. And that issue is central to our discussions today. The need for an independent international inquiry into the 1988 massacre and the prosecution of those responsible for the crime, as well as the extension of the weapons embargo, has widespread cross-party support in both houses of the British Parliament and among legislators in other European parliaments. In this regard, the British Committee for Iran Freedom has parliamentarians from over 15 European and Arab countries for these demands, calling on the international community to act. Colleagues, we need action at UN level on the question of the 1988 massacre. An opportunity to take that action is the expected UN resolution on Iran, condemning human rights violations in the country, which will be voted on later this year in the Third Committee of the UN General Assembly and then in the General Assembly itself. As one of the principal sponsors of that resolution on Iran, the UK must work with allies to make sure that this year's resolution calls for and secures an international independent investigation into the massacre and establishes a subsequent international accountability mechanism to prosecute those who are found responsible. The British government has the backing it needs to take these actions. The call for an independent international investigation into the massacre has strong support among the Iranian people, among the Iranian diaspora, and among international parliamentarians, and has the extension of the weapons embargo and the reimposition of the UN Security Council resolution on Iran. The international community must now act on the three major concerns with regard to Iran: its human rights violations, its destabilizing activities in the Middle East region, and its nuclear and ballistic missiles program. Repeatedly over the last 40 years, the UN has sadly failed to hold the regime to account. But today we are echoing the call of the NCRI's President-elect, Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, to urge the UK government to lead the international effort and work with its allies to end impunity for the regime and its officials by extending the weapons embargo, reimposing all UN Security Council resolutions, and securing an independent international inquiry into the 1988 massacre. Thank you for listening to me, colleagues. With that, I'm very pleased to open this conference. And may I first of all call upon my colleague Steve McCabe, who is a Labour Member of Parliament for Birmingham Selly Oak, a former Labour Party whip, and a very good friend of the Iranian people. Steve.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And can I apologise at the outset for the fact that I am going to have to leave shortly because I'm chairing a bill elsewhere in Parliament. Can I say it's a pleasure to follow you, David? And I want to begin by reflecting on something I heard just the other 3 days ago. I was at home and I heard on the radio that the mullahs are planning another trumped-up charge against Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe. As the original unjust sentence nears a conclusion, they're planning to subject this poor, innocent woman to even more suffering. And it really got me thinking, from Nazanin's life to nuclear weapons, we can't negotiate with these people. They don't respect the rules of law or diplomacy. That's why the UN Security Council were wrong to dismiss calls to extend the weapons embargo. They've strengthened the mullahs by giving the impression that we don't much care if they buy weapons from China, Russia, or anywhere else. These actions increase the risk of more proxy wars in the Middle East and guarantee the regime will be able to subject its own people to greater violence and repression. We've already failed the Iranian people by ignoring the 1988 massacre. We failed them by handing over billions of pounds as a result of the botched nuclear deal, money which has gone to fund terrorism. And we failed them by not supporting the opposition and democratic politicians like Mariam Rajavi. The people we seek to do business with, like Ibrahim Raisi, now the chief of Iran's judiciary, are the same people responsible for the 88 massacre. Once again, people are being arrested for protesting. Once again, prisoners are disappearing. 1,500 people were killed by the security forces during the November protests last year. They were murdered on the order of the Supreme Leader Khamenei, emulating Ayatollah Khomeini, whose fatwa led to the mass executions back in 1988. Amnesty International have recently published a report on the 2019 crackdown. They found widespread evidence of torture and ill treatment against women, men, and even children by the police, security agents, and prison officials. When Ibrahim Raisi's henchmen are not murdering people, they're subjecting them to barbaric tortures, including flogging, waterboarding, electric shocks, and other violence and humiliations. They've been emboldened by the UN Security Council. They feel they can act with impunity. That's why Madam Rajavi has said the regime must not be allowed to buy or export a single bullet and must be held accountable for its constant assault on the fundamental rights and freedoms of the Iranian people. The UK and the international community must stand with the victims. We must support their struggle for genuine democratic change, change that can transform Iran from a pariah state to a valuable international partner. And as David has said, we can do this by calling for an extension of the arms embargo. We can support calls for justice for the victims of the 88 massacre. We should demand that the 2020 UN resolution on Iran includes an article setting out the steps to a proper inquiry and actions against the perpetrators of that massacre. And we can demand that an international commission be allowed to visit Iran's prisons and expose the truth for the world to see. Nothing else will do. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that contribution, Steve. And we're sorry you can't stay for the whole conference, but you have for a long time been a strong supporter of the work of this committee. I have, colleagues, had a message from Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, who has asked me if I will please read it out to you. So I do so now. Honourable members of Parliament, distinguished personalities, fellow compatriots and supporters of the NCRI, thank you for holding this important conference on the Iranian people's human rights. I would also like to express my gratitude to prominent members of both houses of Parliament in the UK, political dignitaries and human rights advocates for standing with the Iranian people and resistance. Dear friends, Amnesty International published a shocking report last week about Iran, entitled Trampling Humanity. The report explained the inhuman treatment of those arrested during the November 2019 uprising. It said that at least 7,000 were arrested during the protests, also explaining the details of the tortures inflicted on the prisoners. The extent of the savagery, before anything else, indicates that the regime has failed to put out the flames of resistance, despite massive crackdown and killing of at least 1,500 people in November. Recently, in another inhuman measure, the clerical regime issued death sentences and long prison terms for 3 brothers for taking part in anti-regime protests. Naveed Afkari, a national sportsman, was sentenced to double executions after suffering cruel tortures. These days also mark the 32nd anniversary of the 1988 massacre of more than 30,000 political prisoners in Iran. The vast majority of the victims were members and supporters of the PMOI. As Baroness Boothroyd once said, this is the greatest unpunished crime against humanity since World War II. The international community, including Europe, turned a blind eye on this great crime because they wanted to appease the mullah's tyranny for petty economic interests. So they ignored the values and principles for which millions of Europeans and others sacrificed their lives. Inaction vis-à-vis this regime, and worse, unity of action to lift the arms embargo undermines human values. To put an end to the crimes of the regime and to counter its warmongering actions in the region, the following steps are necessary. Firstly, an international fact-finding mission must be set up to seek justice for the victims of the 1988 massacre and hold the perpetrators of this grave crime against humanity accountable. And secondly, the UN Security Council must address the terrible situation of human rights in Iran. The Security Council must send to Iran an international delegation accompanied by representatives of the Iranian resistance. They must visit the regime's medieval prisons, visit the prisoners, and particularly meet those arrested during the November 2019 uprising. And thirdly, as the Iranian resistance has called for just a few hours after signing of the JCPOA, the 6 UN resolutions must be reimposed, and all sanctions on weapons sales to Iran must also be reimposed. Supporting the Iranian people's desire to overthrow the regime ruling Iran is necessary for peace and stability in the region. In conclusion, I would like to extend my gratitude to you as elected representatives of the people of Britain and as the UK's elite for persisting on your just positions over the years in defense of the legitimate right of the Iranian people and resistance to struggle for freedom, and for persisting on the need to adopt a firm policy against the mullahs. God bless you all. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Mrs. Rajabi's statement. And ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is my colleague, Bob Blackman, who is the Member of Parliament for Harrow East. Bob.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the NCRI for inviting me to today's very important conference. And I, like many other of my parliamentary colleagues, am honoured to be with you and with the other distinguished speakers that we have today. I want to begin my remarks by saying to the families of the victims of the 1988 massacre in Iran and the survivors, some of whom will share their ordeals with us today, and also the people of Iran, who may be able to listen to this conference either today or at some future time. We hear your voice. We share your outcry for change. And let me be clear, you are not alone. There are many cross-party MPs and peers in the United Kingdom that are standing shoulder to shoulder with you against this gross injustice. We support you, and we will advocate on your behalf until those responsible for this heinous crime against humanity in Iran are brought to justice and are prosecuted by the full extent of the applicable laws. Now, I'm very disappointed that the UK government abstained from the vote in the United Nations Security Council to extend the weapons embargo on Iran. Sadly, we are aligning ourselves with a failed policy of appeasement pursued by the European Union, which for the last 4 decades has provided the regime in Iran with immunity for its egregious human rights violations, including the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners, and on its terrorism to preserve diplomatic dialogue, prioritise trade, and in recent years, keeping alive a disastrous and flawed nuclear deal that ultimately will allow Iran to advance its nuclear and missile program. I was hoping, as many of us others were, that after our exit from the European Union, the United Kingdom would have altered its appeasing Iran policy, and I believe that is what is required for a successful global Britain. Now, it's clear that the appeasement policy pursued by the European Union has been completely counterproductive and has actually only enabled the regime to be emboldened. Now, remember, as we speak, the regime's terrorism has reached European territory. We now know that one of its diplomats is awaiting prosecution for planning a bomb plot against the gathering of the pro-democracy opposition, the NCRI, in Paris in June 2018. I personally and my wife could have been victims if that terrorist attack had been successful. So for me, it is deeply personal. Now, if we just read the recent Amnesty International report, which documents the regime's brutal crackdown on the nationwide protests in Iran since 2019 and the killings of protesters and torture against those arrested, it brings home to everyone what is really going on. Now, imagine if we stand idly by and allow that same regime to arm itself to the teeth with deadly and sophisticated weapons from China or Russia. Obviously, this must change, and the United Kingdom should respectfully reject the European Union's approach on Iran and join our American allies in exerting maximum pressure on the regime in Iran. Make no mistake, the regime in Iran only understands the language of firmness. Like criminals in our own society, the regime in Tehran will contemplate altering behaviour only when its leaders and officials are actually held to account for their crimes and aggression. Now, I share my thoughts of my good friend Steve McCabe, who I think has had to leave our conference in referring to that report. Last year, Amnesty International repeated the same call as demanded by the Iranian resistance with regards to the detainees of the November 2019 protests. It stated that this regime has shown that it will not investigate its own crimes, and therefore it is vital for the United Nations member states to enter and call for independent international investigation on all their crimes, and most importantly of all, on the 1988 massacre. How has our government responded to this? You say you want to achieve achievement in human rights situation through bilateral contact with the Iranian authorities. Let's be honest. The United Kingdom government have talked about Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe for years. It has achieved nothing. The United Nations General Assembly has passed 66 resolutions which only condemns the violations and expects the mullahs to behave better. The United Kingdom government must admit that nothing has changed. Therefore, it's now time for accountability. If our new Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office wants to see a real change in human rights situation in Iran, it must now bring the issue of accountability into the resolution on Iran in the coming United Nations General Assembly. This is how the mullahs start taking the international community seriously, and they will know that the game is over and they cannot fool the world with their deceptions in all fields. Therefore, from what I've said and what my colleagues have said, the following steps are needed. The United Kingdom government must use its new global sanction regime to announce punitive measures against those who are responsible for the 1988 massacre and serious human rights violations in Iran today, which tragically is the very same people, like the regime's Chief Justice, Ebrahim Raisi, and the current Justice Minister, Reza Avai. The UK must work with allies at the United Nations to extend the weapons embargo against Iran without delay and to reimpose all of the international sanctions and the United Nations Security Council resolutions on the regime. The United Kingdom must take the lead at international level and work with allies at the United Nations to establish an independent inquiry into the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in Iran, by including the demand for such investigation in this year's United Nations resolution on Iran, which the United Nations General Assembly is expected to adopt later this year. Now, these three steps should be completed with public support of the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people and the Iranian Resistance Movement, the NCRI, led by President-elect of the NCRI, Madam Rajavi, as the basis for a very firm British policy on Iran. Because in my personal view, the United Kingdom now needs to prepare for the Iran without the theocracy. The United Kingdom must stand with the Iranian people and the resistance movement, the NCRI, at this time when people across the whole of Iran have taken to the street to demand change and to protest against the regime's corruption and repression. Otherwise, the United Kingdom stands on the wrong side of history and would be remembered for this colossal mistake by future generations in Iran. So I close by saying thank you once again for inviting me to speak to this wonderful conference. I wish you all every success in overturning the regime of the mullahs, and I look forward to the time when not only can we meet physically, but we can actually meet physically in a free, democratic Iran.
Thank you very much, Bob. And our next speaker is Sir Alan Meale, who is former Labour Member of Parliament and former Vice President of the Socialist Group in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Alan.
Friends, it's really an honour to be asked to participate in this forum today, as this is a very, very timely conference that's about to start, and indeed it's to celebrate, if you like, the people who are fighting against the memory of this terrible disaster in 1988 and the massacre which took place in Iran. Let me say at the very beginning of my address is that really the people in Iran have been very, very badly let down by the international community. And I say that feeling extremely guilty about it because my own nation is part of that. We let the people down in Iran and all the victims and families which had to pay for the brutality of the Ayatollahs all those years ago. We all know actually that the perpetrators since reaped the benefits of their actions in no uncertain terms. They've all benefited, sadly, from the promotion because of their actions at that period of time. And sadly, we all have got to realise the reason why the fight must go on to free Iran, because many of them remain in post in charge of the people and prisoners which remain incarcerated because of their actions. Now, allowing such in the international community is nothing short of a disgrace. And I say that because we should hang our heads in shame about this. And if you want an example of what it's like, there's been tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have suffered because of this regime's actions. And people have stood idly by and allowed it in the interest of their own trade or relations. And that is nothing short of a disgrace. To turn a blind eye to something because of that is a disgrace. Imagine if we'd done that after the Second World War and the Holocaust. Imagine that if we turned a blind eye and did the same about Pol Pot. And actually, the situation in Iran is nothing short of the same. Now, so far, the Revolutionary Guard and the mullahs have been responsible for tens of thousands of deaths and tortures and incarcerations throughout Iran. And we have stood, as I've said, idly by and acquiesced to their actions, doing very little, not even really sounding heavy terms that we should be cautious with proceeding with that. And I think it's time for it to stop. And what I do ask is three things, essentially, for the panel today. First, with our governments and other Western democracies, particularly those who are members of the Security Council, should actually insist that the UN Security Council resolution against the regime must be reimposed. It's unthinkable that they've even considered any lightening of those actions. And secondly, they must insist that the leadership of the Revolutionary Guard in particular must be held to account for their actions during the last decades. And finally, we must do everything, not turn our eyes away, not turn the blind eye, as I said earlier. We do everything in our powers to say we will fight for and be heard and take action to ensure there's a free and democratic Iran.
In the summer of 1988, the mullah's dictatorship in Iran launched a nationwide massacre of the political prisoners. The treacherous crime started with a decree by Khomeini. The head of Khomeini's Supreme Court made inquiries regarding the implementation of the decree. Khomeini wrote in response, "The main concern is the speed of implementing the death sentences for those who are still loyal to the Mujahideen." Many would not believe that even those who had completed their prison terms to be victims in a massacre, but their last words, craved on the harsh prison walls, attested otherwise. In 1999, in a recorded videotape to the then UN Secretary General, Reza Malik, a former deputy of the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence, said 33,700 political prisoners were executed. Hossein Ali Nagiri, Sharia judge, Mortaza Ishraqi, Revolutionary Court prosecutor of Tehran, Mustafa Pul Mohammadi, representative of the Ministry of Intelligence in the Death Committee, Ismail Shushtari, Ibrahim Raisi.
هیئت مرگ فقط یک معیار داشت. اینکه مجاهدین اسیر هویت سازمانی خودشون رو چی میگن؟ مجاهد یا منافق؟
July 3rd, 1988. I am Malihe Akrami. My so-called trial was held at 3 p.m. and I was condemned to death. Now it's 7 p.m. and I am being taken for execution.
منیره رجوی فقط به خاطر اینکه خواهر رهبر مقاومت بود با همسر و 2 فرزندش دستگیر شده بود. به 2 سال زندان محکوم شده بود. باید در سال 63 آزاد میشد، اما اونا 4 سال اضافه نگه داشتن. در قتل عام 67 به دار کشیدن.
چندین شخص آقای مگیری این بازی اون بازی تو ایشان تو میشه. یک محکوم کرده به 5 سال، یک محکوم کرده به 6 سال، یک محکوم کرده به 10 سال، یک محکوم کرده به 15 سال. خب این که خودمو بیان بدون اینکه فعالیت تازه باشه دیگه ادامه کنه. به نظر من بزرگترین جنایت به جمهوری اسلامی شده و در تاریخ ما رو محکوم میکنه به دست شما انجام کنه و شما رو در آینده جزء جنایتکاران تو تاریخ می‌نویسن.
Montazeri's letter to Khomeini, July 31st, 1988. While these people have been sentenced by our courts to prison terms, to suddenly execute them without any new activity is a complete disregard for all judicial standards and rulings. If you insist on your decree, then at least issue an order to spare the women with children. The execution of several thousand prisoners in a few days will not have positive repercussions and will not be devoid of mistakes. In a 200-page report in 2019 entitled Blood-Soaked Secrets, Amnesty International detailed the manner in which 30,000 political prisoners were sentenced to death, executed, and buried in secret mass graves.
میخوام قبر بچه‌ام پیدا کنم. میخوام ببینم گور بچه‌ام کجا هستن. که یه روز یک زنده موندم رفتم ایران، برم خودم بنازم رو قبر بچه‌ام. برم بچه‌ام ببینم. خودم بنازم رو قبر بچه‌ام.
In a tweet on July 17, 2020, State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortagus stated that the death commissions began their work on July 19, 1988, and thousands of political prisoners were executed on orders of Khomeini.
July 19th marks the anniversary of the start of Iran's so-called death commissions. On the orders of Ayatollah Khamenei, these commissions reportedly forcibly disappeared and extrajudicially executed thousands of political dissident prisoners. The current head of the Iranian judiciary and current minister of justice have both been identified as former members of these death commissions. The Iranian judiciary is widely perceived to lack independence and fair trial guarantees, and the revolutionary courts are particularly egregious in ordering violations of human rights. All Iranian officials who commit human rights violations or abuses should be held accountable. The United States calls on the international community to conduct independent investigations and to provide accountability and justice for the victims of these horrendous violations of human rights organized by the Iranian regime.
The masterminds and perpetrators of this manifest case of crime against humanity must be prosecuted and punished.
And our next speaker is Kirsty Brimelow, QC, former president of the Bar Human Rights Committee and winner of the first 100 Years Inspirational Woman Barrister of the Year 2018. Kirsty.
Thank you. I'm going to address my own experience with the work to bring about a UN tribunal to investigate and to hear the evidence in the 1988 massacre. The evidence itself, others will speak about undoubtedly today, and it is very well known and very well reported, and it isn't in any way denied by Iran. So looking back to my own personal involvement, that really came about in around 2015. In 2016, I was in Geneva as part of the launch of the Justice for Victims of the 1988 massacre. And in February 2018, I was back in Geneva acting as counsel to a People's Tribunal in Geneva. And we then spent the day hearing accounts of family members of victims and of survivors of the 1988 massacre in Iran. The accounts of the 1988 massacre given to the tribunal included from a father who described receiving the news of the execution of his daughter by being told to pay for the cost of the bullets used to execute her. They included accounts from relatives still seeking information about their loved ones. They now, or by that stage, had a very low expectation, which was simply to know where their loved ones were buried so that they might be able to bury them themselves with dignity and in accordance with their religion. Their bodies continue to lie unidentified in mass graves in Iran, and many will be familiar with the work of Amnesty International in its reports in identifying more and more sites where mass graves are being uncovered and unfortunately too being destroyed. One elderly woman, Fatima Safarian, spoke of still believing that her son might still be alive somewhere. She thought he's still perhaps in a prison, unlocated somewhere in Iran. And very sadly, very movingly, she spoke of how she actually still sleeps in the living room of her house near the door so that she doesn't miss the news of his return. There's much evidence of the massacre also in Amnesty International's reports, including its 2018 report, where it analysed evidence from 41 survivors, 54 family members, 11 former prisoners, and 10 other witnesses from 28 cities across Iran. Plus, it analysed the audio tape, which many will be familiar with. This was an audio tape which emerged on the 9th of August 2016, which recorded discussions between the high-level actors in the death commissions, including Khomeini, and from the 15th of August 1988. And it was made clear in this audio by Khomeini that pregnant women and girls should also be killed. There was to be no exception, certainly no application of any law, including international law, and fundamentally no mercy. Other evidence, the secret fatwa from Ayatollah Khomeini emerged in 2000. That was the fatwa which is said to be behind the original ordering of the killing and seems to be accepted as being the basis of the start of the massacre. And we've heard the figures given as at least 33,700 were killed during this short time in 1988. I'm going to finish. As a lawyer, there's plenty of evidence. What else do you need? You need a criminal law framework or an international law framework. We have that. There's plenty of evidence of crimes against humanity, possibly genocide, and a whole raft of breaches of international law, including violations of fair trial rights. There's absolutely no due process. These hearings took 2 to 3 minutes, and if a person gave an answer which was considered the wrong answer, they literally were then rounded up to be killed, hanged in groups, shot in groups, and it's reported that over a short period of only 2 weeks, 8,000 people were executed in this way. The suspects is the other part that you obviously need in setting up any tribunal. These suspects are not faceless. Again, they're set out, the names are set out in Amnesty's report in 2018. It lists 6 people there who participated in the death commissions. And many of those people also have made public statements, including as recently as 2019, when Mustafa Pour Mohammadi actually tried to justify his part in those death commissions. And so his justification or his defense could be heard within a tribunal. The tribunal itself does not need the cooperation of Iran. It can be set up separately by the UN, and reparations remedies should include facilitating both the return of human remains of deceased victims to family members and the performance of funeral and cultural rites for the dead. The past infects the present, has already been referred to. And whilst there's no time limit on justice for crimes against humanity, practically, we need to move swiftly because the evidence continues to be destroyed and witnesses are becoming older and are dying. And globally, and as an ethos, what we see is ongoing impunity in Iran, with this being affirmed as recently as the 36th session of the Human Rights Council, when the former UN Commissioner for Human Rights, Sayed Ra'ad al-Hussein, said that Iran remains the country with the highest reported rates of executions per capita. Many of those executed are drug offenders not guilty of the most serious crimes under international law, so in breach of international law, which continues. I'll end, as I often do when I make these talks, with some pointing not only to the courage of the survivors, the families, and the friends of those who still want answers and fundamentally want to see justice, but also to the only leader within Iran around this time, Motazzeri, who had the moral courage to actually object to what was going on. And there is an onus on the international community to honour the courage he showed back then. He said this: "In my view, the biggest crime in the Islamic Republic, for which history will condemn us, has been committed at your hands, and they'll write your names as criminals in history." It's time that that process actually starts within a legal framework, and the UN is the body that is set up and was set up post-World War II to address crimes against humanity such as this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Our next speaker is my colleague, the Right Honourable Sir Roger Gale, who is the Conservative Member of Parliament for North Thanet. And Roger is also the head of the 18-member British parliamentary delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Roger.
Thank you very much, David. I will be very brief, if I may, because following Kirsty Brownlow is quite difficult when you're dealing with the amount of legal knowledge that she's clearly got. And I think she's spelled out the legal position very clearly indeed. We are all aware of the fact that there is overwhelming evidence in connection with these crimes. We're aware of the fact that there are perpetrators. We're aware of the fact that there is international law that can and should allow the UN to intervene. And I think it behoves all of us to try and press that case as hard as we possibly can. As David has said, I also lead the parliamentary delegation to the Assembly of the Council of Europe, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe at the moment. And these human rights issues, of course, are very much on the Council of Europe agenda, although obviously Iraq is not a member state. But nevertheless, they are matters of considerable international interest. And that is a possible forum for us to try to raise the cause over and over again. And I congratulate the members of the NCRI who have in the past so diligently attended our plenary sessions. Of course, those plenary sessions are not being held at the moment, but in the past have done so, and sought at every opportunity to press the case. My real reason, David, for wanting to intervene very briefly this morning is simply to reiterate, as no doubt you have already done, the fact that there is a significant number of parliamentary colleagues in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords who support this cause, who believe passionately in the righting of wrongs and the right of nation states to freedom and democracy. And as long as all or any of us are able to do so, we will continue to press that case. And that is really all I want to say. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you. Our next speaker is Senator Michelle Mulherin of the Fianna Gael Party of the Republic of Ireland. Michelle.
Hello, good morning.
Yes.
It's an honor to be invited to attend this conference and to hear speakers contribute in the cause for justice and accountability. I believe when we see a government of a country turn on its own people, it is an obligation on the part of the international community to take action. And I would just like briefly just to say that I support the call for justice and accountability in relation to the 1988 massacres. There are families here who very much want to achieve justice, as we would all in these circumstances. And for my own part, I support the call and the efforts. And it is an issue that I have taken up in the past with our Minister for Foreign Affairs and the government, and I will continue to do so.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And now I'd like to call an old friend, please. Dalat Naurouzi, who is the UK representative of the NCRI.
Thank you so much, David. It's an honor for me to be with you all today, and I'm so grateful to your chairship for this conference, online conference. I'm also grateful and deeply appreciate all your relentless effort throughout many years in supporting the Iranian resistance people struggle for freedom and democracy, and particularly their organized movement, the PMOI, the Mujahideen, both in Ashraf and also around the world, and the NCRI for actually leading this campaign, particularly our president-elect, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, that called upon the international community for justice for the victims of the 1988 massacre. It was since 2015 that our president took the lead in calling upon the world community and parliamentarians, governments, the United Nations, particularly the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as the Special Rapporteur on Iran, in order to bring about an international independent inquiry mission to make investigation, to bring the perpetrators to justice, to be able to actually go deep into the extent of this horrible crime committed by the officials of this regime, that many of them at the moment not only are not in hiding, but actually they've taken even much higher position within the mullah's regime hierarchy, and particularly the head of the judiciary power and the judiciary system of the mullahs, which is totally outlaw and of course not compatible to any international norm or standards. But actually that very criminal institution was responsible, the Death Commission, for carrying out this huge, heinous crime against just simply the freedom lovers and the outspoken criticizers of this regime, and mishandling and gross violations of human rights that they have committed throughout many, many years in Iran. I have to say, unfortunately, I have seen and witnessed the world community and some countries, and in my view, lobbies of policies of appeasement, calling for the lifting of the sanctions under the pretext that it would hurt or damage the Iranian people's life. But everyone knows that after the so-called nuclear agreement in 2015. It was much worse in terms of both social, political. The life of the Iranian people turned into much more misery and facing poverty almost in all various sectors of Iranian society because of huge corruption amongst various layers of this regime. They call that this actually corruption has been institutionalized. Many of officials of the regime acknowledged that huge amount of the money are in the hands of Khamenei, the supreme leader, and 5 major foundations related to him. At least some 200 billions of dollars are in the hands of Khamenei, and particularly its Revolutionary Guards Corps, or we call them Pasdaran. And we have seen how they have been responsible in spending the money, not only for the suppression and repression of Iranian people, and that's why this regime is actually the number 1 in terms of executions in the whole world per capita. And also we have seen how they have been spending the money not only for repression in Iran, but also for expanding and spreading terrorism, supporting financially various terror groups in different countries, particularly Bashar Assad in Syria. Billions of dollars spent in that very nightmare war that resulted in at least 13 million Syrian people homeless. Some, at least 3 million of them, are behind borders in Europe seeking refuge because of non-stop continuous bombing of their civilian cities and huge destruction. We've seen them supporting particularly Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is widely spreading and actually playing a role in terrorism and in massacre of many people, not only in Syria, but also in Lebanon, in Yemen, and we have seen them even in Iraq and in Iran, smashing widespread protests and demonstrations around Iran, particularly in 2018. I have to say that the world community should realize that the illusion is no longer valid. They have to see the reality, and they have to take very substantive steps in order to bring about justice and to punish this outlaw, inhumane regime. They call themselves a government, but they are not in no way representing the Iranian people. It is a creature, it's a beast. They should be called 7-headed dragons that only are responsible for terrible human rights violations and atrocities they committed against both Iranians and many people in the region. The war in Iraq, the continuous war in Yemen, all that started with $150 billion that was given to this regime when the sanctions were lifted under the so-called banner of this nuclear agreement. Justice needs to be done. Members of parliament in Europe, particularly the European Union, the United States, and all around the world, the Middle East, need to cry out. They need to shoulder stand with the Iranian people, demanding that the world community needs not to give any further concession to the mullahs, rather than giving them millions and billions of dollars in order to carry on with killing our youngsters, with killing Navid Afghari, killing Ali Younesi, Amir Hossein Moradi, and many, many thousands more of political prisoners or university students that just had the guts and the courage in order to stand up and cry for freedom, for a nation that only strives for justice and for humanity and human values. That needs to be respected. That needs to be supported by the world community, not criminals in the name of so-called a regime that we know only stays in power because of repression and terrorism. So what we need to call upon is for the United Nations, the Secretary General, various Secretary of State, whether in the United Kingdom or elsewhere in Europe. They need to stop giving concessions. Don't give any money to this regime under whatever banner, whether you want to release Nazanin or any other hostage taken officially by this regime under many various lies that they are so-called spies, or they are counter-revolutionaries, or that they are enemies of God. All this nonsense are only justification for their terror and repression. We need the world community to take substantive steps, first of all, by supporting the NCRI, Maryam Rajavi, president-elect of this resistance movement, for its platform to bring about democracy and freedom in Iran. Second, we need that the embassies of this regime to close down. They were the ones that wanted to bomb our gathering in Paris in 2018, the gathering in Albania in 2019. That regime and their so-called embassies and ambassadors must be expelled, and those actually embassies to close down, because they're not used for any diplomatic or any mutual interests and vital interests of the world community and relationship with other countries in the world. They are just made for them to carry on their plots, their bombings against Iranian dissidents and the world community. And many politicians around Europe that had the courage to stand with our movement. So what I need to ask you is to continue your efforts. Please stand with the Iranian people to continue supporting their uprising. Everyone has seen, especially what happened in 2019, what happened when the regime shot down the IRGC and passed on the Ukrainian aircraft in order to kill 176 passengers, in order to actually blackmail the world community to give them further concession. That needs to be stopped. We need to see the reimposition of all the sanctions, particularly the 6 resolutions that were passed by the Security Council, and we need all these sanctions immediately. The regime has confessed itself that billions of dollars are lost because no one knows where they have been. 22 billion was given by the Central Bank of Iran to this regime officials to buy goods for the Iranian people for production, but half of it is lost. And this is the story we have heard over and over. The corruption must end. This regime needs to be overthrown by the hands of Iranian people. We need the support of international community to carry on their efforts to bring about maximum pressure against this regime and to take steps that to actually guarantee the support for freedom and democracy to be established in future Iran. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Dola. That was a magnificent talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you.
And colleagues, our next speaker is my colleague, Martin Vickers, who is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Cleethorpes. Martin.
Thank you, David. And what we have just heard, which you rightly describe as a magnificent contribution, highlights yet again why we must give maximum support to the NCRI. And I echo the words of my colleague Sir Roger Gale a few moments ago. And as he rightly said, he is our leader in the Council of Europe Assembly, and I'm a member of our delegation there, and I will certainly do all I can to support Sir Roger and others in their efforts to bring about peace and human rights in Iran. What we've heard from other contributions this morning yet again highlights the injustices and the evidence, the growing evidence, I think it's fair to say, that Iran is involved in warmongering activities in so many different parts of the world, causing instability and harm and danger to all of us. I, again, as I have done on previous occasions, congratulate all the work of the NCRI. You've done so much here in the Houses of Parliament in Westminster to increase support amongst my colleagues, and I can assure you that I will continue to give you support and to help and increase that support here in Westminster. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Martin. We now have a pre-recorded clip by Senator Ivana Bacik. Ivana is an Irish Labour Party politician. She served as leader of the Labour Party in the Irish Senate since May of 2011 and is senator for the University of Dublin.
Thank you to the British Committee for Iran Freedom for inviting me to speak at this important conference. Sorry I can't be there in person. I have to speak at our parliamentary sittings today. In 1988, between July and September, it is known that the Iranian authorities forcibly disappeared and extrajudicially executed thousands of imprisoned political dissidents in secret. Their bodies were dumped mostly in unmarked mass graves. As Amnesty International have documented so clearly in their 2018 report, Blood-Soaked Secrets, the Iranian authorities have since 1988 treated the killings as state secrets, tormenting the relatives by refusing to tell them how and why their loved ones were killed and where they are buried. No official has been brought to justice. In some cases, those involved hold or have held positions of power in Iran. Quote, the Amnesty report calls on the UN to set up an independent investigation to help bring those responsible for these abhorrent crimes to justice. I support this call by Amnesty and by your committee for the establishment of an independent international investigation into the massacre and for the inclusion of such a demand in this year's United Nations resolution. I, of course, serve in the Senate or Seanad of Ireland, that is the upper house of the Irish Parliament, or Oireachtas, as a Labour Party senator. This year, we were all delighted that Ireland secured a seat on the United Nations Security Council. Along with my parliamentary colleagues and Labour's Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Deputy Brendan Howlin, I will be proactive in calling for the Irish seat to be used to advance the cause of human rights internationally. This activism must include a call for the end to and investigation of all extrajudicial state-sanctioned killings. My own grandfather, Karel Bacik, was involved in the Czech resistance in his home country of Czechoslovakia and was imprisoned by the Nazis during World War II. So my passion for human rights and to protect those who defend them do derive from my own family experience. Responsibility lies with us as legislators and as human rights defenders to ensure that issues like this are not swept under the carpet. We must send a message to the Iranian regime that the world is watching. Without a strong stance on human rights violations of the past, we leave the door open to them to continue in the future. So I want to conclude by expressing my solidarity with those who are pursuing justice for the victims of the 1988 massacre. Thank you. Gurav Mahagwit.
Thank you. Now we remain in Ireland with Jim Higgins, who is the former president of the Irish delegation in the European Parliament. Jim.
Thank you very much indeed, David. And it's an honor for me to participate in this particular conference. It's an honor because I've had the privilege, since I was elected to the European Parliament in 2004, of highlighting the various and the numerous atrocities that have been perpetrated on the people of Iran. The attacks on Camp Ashraf, aided and abetted by the Iraqi regime, the appalling conditions in which the refugees, if we call them such, from Iran were treated in so-called Camp Liberty. But two things stand out in relation to this conference today. First of all, it is how graphically the video illustrated what happened in July and August 1988. And secondly, one of the most powerful, passionate and practical contributions by the NCRI delegate literally 5 minutes ago. It was absolutely hypnotic in terms of its power and its strength and its passion. And she brought home very forcibly our obligations, because it is appalling that 32 years after this atrocity, nothing has happened in terms of a deep, incisive forensic investigation as to who did what. It is appalling that the perpetrators are still out there and hold positions of power. It is appalling that the mass slaughter of innocents, men, women, and children, on the basis of that they were the enemies of God, is still allowed to travel unauthorized from the point of view of bringing sanctions. And it is appalling, as Kirsty said, that all of the evidence is there, and there's a bulk of evidence, circumstantial evidence, forensic evidence, practical evidence of exactly what went on. I mean, it is patently obvious that all of this was authorized from on high, that there was a three-man committee who decided who was to be killed and how they were to be killed. It was decided that they were going to be buried in mass graves. Those graves are somewhere inside the territory of Iran, and we need to find them and to give dignity to those who are barbarically slaughtered. And it is damning also that we have a recording of actually what went on and who planned it. You know, we've had report after report, and the Amnesty report in relation to its title says it all, blood-soaked secrets. So why have we had no independent inquiry? It has been said by all of the contributors today that we all stand indicted, that effectively the international community has stood idly by. And as a member of the European Parliament, I time and time again raise the issue. But I'm not surprised, in fact, that our EU foreign policy chief, previously Federica Mogherini, has stood idly by and has decided that diplomacy and appeasement is the best strategy. Weakness. And again, our present person responsibility, the EU foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, who actually was the president of the European Parliament when I was elected in 2004, again has decided that diplomacy and appeasement is the better policy. When you're dealing with a rogue state, which is Iran, appeasement and diplomacy doesn't count. They don't abide by any international norms or agreements. So what we need to do is, as has been said, we need a collective effort. And let's make it happen. Let's not be back this day next year, 33 years after the atrocity, wringing our hands and wondering why nothing has happened. We need action. We need action under the aegis of the United Nations. We need collective action, cohesive action by the United States, by the United Kingdom, by the European Union, and by other allies to bring about an end to this terrible regime. And as has been said already, the United Nations resolution is there, but it needs support. I am very happy to say that our Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, and I, into the European Parliament together in June of 2004. I'm very happy, as Ivana Bacik has said, that Ireland, for the first time in many years, has now a seat on the all-important Security Council. And I'm very happy to say that when this conference is over, I will be approaching and contacting directly my colleague, Simon Coveney, our Foreign Affairs Minister, to ensure that Ireland does its bit as a member of the Security Council to support the resolution. And can I say, in conclusion, I will also have one of my colleagues raise this matter within the next week or two in the Irish Parliament, because we cannot stand idly by and allow this to go unchecked, to allow this to go unanswered for, and to allow this to continue to be something of which we are all universally ashamed that it has been allowed to happen for so long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you. And now, colleagues, we have two young people who are members of the families of some of the victims of the 1988 massacre. They're Umid and Damuna, and I'd like to ask them to address you now, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, dear friends. I'm very pleased to be able to address all of you here today. As part of two testimonies regarding this 1988 massacre, of which the event today is mainly centered around, I'm going to be delivering my testimony, and as Mr. Jones rightly said, I'll be followed by Damuna from Ashraf 3. Many of you may already know me, and for some of you, I may be a new face, but nonetheless, I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce myself to all of you. My name is Omid Ibrahimi. I'm 23 years old, and I'm a third-year medical student studying in Italy. I lost 5 of my mom's relatives at the hands of the regime. There were 2 of my mom's aunties who were executed as part of the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners, 2 of my mom's uncles, and my mom's brother. So my mom's aunties are Ruhangiz and Sohaila Muhammad Rahimi. As I said, they were executed as part of this massacre. My mom's uncles will be Aziz Mohammed Rahimi and Hushain Mohammed Rahimi, and my mom's brother Hossein Majidi, who was just 16 years old when he was forcibly taken away right under my grandmother's very eyes, and they never saw him again. And only 7 years after he was forcibly taken away did they understand of his execution. I heard early on in this event that I think it was Kirsty Brimlow QC who said that there was an instance of a certain family who had loved ones executed by the regime, and they went to prison, and the regime told them that they had to pay for the bullets that the regime used to kill the loved one that the regime killed. This is another one of those instances. My mom's family or my grandmother's family, I should say, were told to pay for the bullets that were used to kill my mom's aunties and my mom's uncles. Of course, this is not new or surprising from this regime. A regime who already has a horrific profile, a regime who's killed 120,000 of Iran's finest simply for taking part in activities against its theocratic rule. My dad, Ahmad Ebrahimi, was also a direct witness to the 1988 massacre, as he was imprisoned for 10 years from 1981 to 1991. He'd already bore witness to many of the regime's heinous crimes leading up to this massacre. But all of that was to pale in comparison to what happened in a matter of the weeks and months in the summer of 1988. It is very tough for him, but from time to time when he does talk about it, I hear of him that some of the best friends that he had made in his life were the friends that he made during his time in prison. I also heard of him the various forms of torture that really, quite frankly, belong in the Middle Ages. The barbaric treatment, the humiliation of prisoners, and the execution of prisoners from all ages. Underage prisoners, those under 18, and even some who were under 18 and were constantly reminded of their 18th birthday being the day of their execution. Pregnant women, and even those who had fully served their so-called sentences, from which they were sentenced on charges that were false and bogus through kangaroo courts. They were kept in prison and then executed as part of this massacre. It is, as I said, already very painful for him to talk about all of this. And to this day, he considers himself very lucky to still be among us today. I'd love to talk about this to all of you personally, go deeper into this issue and expose more about this. And I'm sure that my dad can add a lot more that I haven't, but unfortunately time is of the essence. And I'd like to take this opportunity once again to thank all of you for supporting all our campaigns and being with us through thick and through thin. And hopefully we have many, many more successes on the horizon. And by the end of it, it will be the overthrow of this regime and freedom for the Iranian people. That's it from me. And I'll hand over to Damona, as I said, from Ashraf 3, for her to give you her account of what happened back then.
Hello, distinguished guests. My name is Damona Talboni. My father was executed in the 1988. My mother was a political activist, and I was arrested with her twice to experience prison as a child. When I went to prison for the second time, I was only 6 years old. I remember the blindfolded prisoners sitting with bleeding food outside the doors of the integration rooms. I remember the voices I heard from the prisoners shouting and crying out while they were being tortured. 1 year later, my father was arrested for the third time, and I was almost sure what would be happening with him. I was 10 when one day my mother told me that he has been executed. As I grew up, I would hear very inspiring stories about the high spirits of the victims of that massacre, where each prisoner was asked just one question in a 1-minute trial. The question was, do you support the MEK Anyone who said yes would be executed. Anyone denied would survive. I'm not sure such an epic can be found in any other movement where not just one person, but 30,000 said yes. I was curious to know how my father turned that page and the moment he were asked. I wrote letters to the numbers of prisoners who were in the prison on that time, and I received 3 letters. I got one from one of his best friends, cellmate from the prison. He wrote, after your father was taken into the courtroom, we were watching the scene through the keyhole in the door. It took only a few minutes. We saw 2 guards grab your father's arms and drop him on the ground to the death corridor. We never found out what he told them at that moment, but it turned out that he had been severely beaten. I remember my feeling when I read these sentences. In one hand, I shed tears because I dearly loved my father. On the other hand, I was proud of him when I realized that he chose with dignity to be executed for the sake of his people and freedom of our country rather than submission. It's almost hard for me to talk about myself, but I know that there are 30,000. Most of them, our stories are known and the names are unknown. The only reason I dare to stand here is to be the voice of them who never talked and are only numbers, and we are still seeking for their names and for their families. But I'm sure about one thing, and what was their message. They all loved the beauty of their life so much that they couldn't accept to enjoy themselves while others were forbidden. They made the decision to sacrifice their lives so no one should have to sell their bones and eyes for food in our country. The Iranian cannot be known with a bunch of medieval anti-human mullahs. We are known by those 30,000, which includes from young girls from 13 years old and elderly women who were 60 years old, those whose blood runs in the veins of every single Iranian here in Ashraf 3, and those rise up in the streets of Iran every day in our country. Now, I would like to say to Khamenei, Raisi, Rouhani, and the rest of those who were involved in the 1988 massacre, and they are still in the power, I would say, fear these names. The 30,000 have multiplied, and you hear their echo. You hear their echo every day in the Iran streets, and the horrific crimes you have committed every day only add our determination for overthrowing your regime. And the day is near when every single of you will be held accountable. Finally, on behalf of myself and all the MK members, I would like to commend Ms. Maryam Ajavi, the one who has made all this sacrifice come to fruition. Over the 40 years, she has kept our struggle alive and ablaze with her own continuous sacrifice in every minute. She taught us how to extend our compassion to our people by creating a pattern of highest human relationships among ourselves. Ms. Rajavi, I promise to you that I will hold to these values and sacrifices just like you did. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damuna, and thank you to Omid. Those were very powerful testimonies. I'm sure you will all agree. Our next speaker is the distinguished human rights lawyer, Tahar Boumedra, who was formerly chief of the Human Rights Office of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iran. He was the regional director of Penal Reform International for the Middle East and North Africa, and based in Amman in Jordan. Tahar.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In fact, it's all said and well documented. There is a crime against humanity that took place. The United Nations have been informed. The successive special rapporteurs of the United Nations on the situation of human rights in Iran had consistently called on Iran to investigate such a crime. And what happened? The special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iran has been banned from visiting Iran. So it's clear Iran is unwilling to investigate, and the United Nations has proven to be reluctant on imposing such an investigation. So my question is, what's next? The reality is that the coming United Nations resolution, General Assembly resolution, should focus on setting up a commission, an independent commission to investigate such a crime against humanity, rather than calling on the perpetrators themselves to investigate. Perpetrators are not willing. Iran is unwilling to investigate such a crime. Therefore, we have to be realistic and take action. I join my voice to previous voices who called for immediate action, but this action must not be calling on Iran to investigate itself. It must be for setting up an independent commission for investigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tahabo Medra. And now we have a short piece of music from Ashraf 3, focusing on the 1988 massacre. And the next speaker is my friend and colleague, the Right Honourable Sammy Wilson, who is the Democratic Unionist Party Member of Parliament for East Antrim. Sammy.
First of all, can I say that I'm deeply honoured to be asked to participate in your conference today. As someone who lives in a country where freedom of speech is taken for granted, where governments can be changed and held to account, I've been deeply moved by the stories I've heard today of families and individuals who have lost their freedom, been tortured, been killed, been buried in secret, hidden away because they dared to want the freedoms which we take for granted. And as I listen to the stories, and on this 32nd anniversary of the killing of so many people who simply wanted to exercise what we regard as a democratic right, I think it is important that democracies such as the United Kingdom stand side by side with those families in Iran who have suffered in the past and who, unfortunately, because of the way in which the regime has got away with its past crimes, still perpetuates those crimes today. And we have heard about the protests in November of last year, and the number of people who took part in those who have also been killed, disappeared, and have lost their lives because they dared to stand up. And what's even worse is that the perpetrators, people who have been caught, and I understand that this is now well documented, tape recordings of the planning of the massacres, defense by those who were involved of the massacres because it was part of Sharia law and they were entitled to do what they wanted, investigations by Amnesty International. All of this is well documented, and yet the perpetrators now hold high positions in your country and seem to be immune from prosecution. As a parliamentarian, I've been pleased to work with the NCRI in the United Kingdom. They keep us well informed of what happens and what is happening in Iran. And I think it is important that we continue to press our government, whether it's through motions in the House of Commons, questions to ministers, letters to ministers, keep up the pressure. And I see that our government can do three things. First of all, ensure that this is continually raised at the United Nations, that we have the ability to put sanctions on those individuals who have been identified as being part of these massacres and having planned and perpetrated them. And most importantly, that we have an international inquiry, an independent inquiry, not an inquiry carried out by the murderers themselves, but an inquiry carried out independently, internationally, to expose these regimes, what this regime has done. It is important, and I do believe that we do have obligations across the world to ensure that genocidal and dictatorial regimes are not allowed to treat their own people in the way in which we have seen people in Iran have been treated. And as a parliamentarian in a democracy, I value democracy. I value the freedoms I have. I want to see those freedoms extended to others. I want to see them extended to your beautiful country. And I believe that it is important that we don't turn a blind eye to what has happened.
Thank you very much, Sammy. Thank you. And now we're going to hear from Lord Ken McGuinness, who is a senior member of the British Committee for Iran Freedom. Ken.
Good afternoon. It's a great privilege to be with you and the other distinguished colleagues and speakers today. I want to begin by thanking the organisers for making this conference possible. The subject at the heart of today's discussion is so important that it cannot be delayed to some time after the pandemic when things return to normal. 8 years ago, we were told by the media, the government civil servants, and the experts that Rouhani was a moderate, was interested in engaging with the West and reforming the regime's malign policies. If the West reached out, respected Iran's interests, and rewarded its leaders with incentives, Tehran was showered with incentives that culminated in the sanctions relief and the lifting of international embargoes under the 2015 nuclear deal. Yet the only change we saw in the regime's malign behavior was a worsening in all areas: human rights, destabilizing activities in the region, and advancing its nuclear weapons program. Many of my colleagues and I in the Iran Freedom Committee warned about exactly this development beforehand, pointing to the fact that Rouhani was more a regime insider and is on a mission to deceive the international community to ease pressure in the actual tyrannical authority in Iran. The supreme leader Khamenei and his private army, the IRCG. And I must say, sadly, that today's reality on the ground in Iran and in the Middle East proves us right and our government wrong. The sad reality is that the FCO's, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office's elusive belief on the emergence of a reformist, moderate faction from within the current theocratic dictatorship has paralyzed successive United Kingdom governments, regardless of which party, and stopped the UK from adopting an effective, successful policy on Iran. Today, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office has realized its past delusions, but is now making another mistake. Today, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is guided not by illusion, but by fear from the clerical regime ruling Iran. It is mistaken as if Khamenei is as strong as it still claims he is. This is absolutely not the case. The mullah's regime is at its weakest point today and is extremely vulnerable both internally and internationally. Guided by its mistake in overestimating the regime's strength, our government is still sending a weak signal to the regime. The United Kingdom has refrained from asking for and ensuring accountability for serious human rights violations in Iran, like the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners. The United Kingdom is now similarly refusing to support reimposing United Nations Security Council resolutions on Iran, despite Tehran regime breaching the 2015 nuclear deal, and does not back extending the weapons embargo, despite the regime's increasing terrorism and destabilizing activities in the region. However, the bizarre reality is that our United Kingdom citizens are seriously concerned about the consequences of these developments and condemns the regime's behavior strongly. Yet ironically, our United Kingdom government is not able to act on its concerns other than doubling down on the shameful and weak appeasement policy, effectively allowing Tehran to ignore the United Kingdom's policy on Iran hostages and in my view, more or less dictate the UK's Iran policy. We in the Iran Freedom Committee have said on several occasions, and will continue to do so, that the UK government must change this dynamic by adopting a firm policy in Iran and putting maximum pressure on the regime in all areas. During the recent nationwide protest in Iran, one of the popular slogans chanted by protesters was quite simply, "Hardliners, the game is over." Therefore, the United Kingdom should be standing with the Iranian people and wish their resistance movement led by Madam Rajavi, because they are the real driving force for change in Iran. Obviously, as others have said, a good start for such firm policy in Iran is to begin to hold the brutal leaders in Tehran to account. An appropriate and practical step in this regard is to secure an international inquiry into the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in Iran, which is also demanded by the Iranian people, the NCRI, as well as current Iranian activists and respected international NGOs like Amnesty International. I echo and support these calls, and again beg, I urge my government to secure this international inquiry through international venues like the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you. And our next speaker is Professor Sarah Chandler. Sarah.
Thank you for inviting me to join you as we remember those massacred in the prisons in 1988 and demand justice for the dead and their families. I'm here as a solicitor and a human rights defender to express my grave concern and shame at the incapacity of the World Forum to bring the perpetrators of the massacre to account. The United Nations General Assembly more than a decade ago asked the Iranian authorities to investigate current and previous human rights violations. In other words, to investigate itself. And the reality is that the justice system in Iran is part of the apparatus of suppression of human rights defenders. It's been described by Amnesty as legalizing brutality. There's a long catalogue of the floggings, amputations, blindings, and other cruel and inhuman treatment of detained and imprisoned people. This is most recently catalogued in the Amnesty report of last week. The international legal community, of which I am a member, like Kirsty, like Tahar, upholds the rule of law and seeks to ensure that it is upheld in every country in the world. A basic part of the rule of law must be the independence of the judicial system. There is no independence of the judicial system in Iran. On the 26th of June last year, Amnesty International released this statement. The Iranian authorities' ongoing refusal to acknowledge the deaths or to reveal the fate and whereabouts of those forcibly disappeared and killed has placed a cruel burden on family members who continue to be haunted by a sense of anguish, uncertainty, and injustice. There is no doubt that the agonizing suffering inflicted on victims' families for more than 30 years violates the absolute prohibition on torture and other cruel and inhuman treatment under international law. The Iranian regime is incapable of conducting an independent or fair investigation of crimes committed by its own officials. Following extensive research and legal analysis, Amnesty denounced the killings as extrajudicial executions, a significant term from a criminal justice perspective. Amnesty defines extrajudicial execution as the unlawful and deliberate killing of a person carried out by order of a government or with its complicity or acquiescence, and carried out with no pretense of legality. The committees or the death commissions bore no resemblance to a court. They did not operate within existing legislation. They were not concerned with establishing the guilt or innocence of defendants regarding an internationally recognized criminal offense. Prisoners were not informed that they were condemned to death until shortly before their executions. They were not told why they were faced with questions or that their answers could condemn them to death. There was no possibility of appeal at any point during the process. Amnesty International therefore categorized that the mass executions were both summary and extrajudicial in nature, and deemed it important to express its legal conclusion that the mass executions constituted crimes under international law in themselves, regardless of whether they form part of a widespread or systematic attack on the civilian population, and therefore constituted crimes against humanity. Authoritative sources on international law have consistently used the term extrajudicial execution when making the argument that arbitrary deprivation of life can amount to crimes under international law. And the characterization of the 1988 massacres as extrajudicial executions does not shift criminal responsibility away from members of the judiciary involved in the death commissions. On the contrary, their involvement in these commissions places them under suspicion of criminal responsibility for crimes under international law. Given that there is no prospect for justice for victims of these crimes in Iran, the United Nations must set up an independent investigation into the extrajudicial executions and the enforced disappearances to establish the truth, enable prosecutions of those suspected of responsibility, and ensure that survivors and families of victims receive reparations. The world needs to know the exact number of those killed in 1988, their identities, the date, location, cause, and circumstances of each enforced disappearance and extrajudicial execution, and the location of their remains. Those suspected of responsibility must be prosecuted. The survivors and families of victims must be provided with reparation in accordance with international standards. The Western democracies, and especially the UK, should demand an international inquiry into the massacre and international accountability process in this year's UN resolution on Iran. I share the call on member states of the UN Human Rights Council, again, especially the UK, to mandate a UN inquiry into the widespread and systematic patterns of mass arrests, enforced disappearances, torture, and unfair trials of detainees, as well as the unlawful killings of protesters and bystanders that took place during and in the aftermath of last November's protests, with a view to ensuring accountability and guarantees of non-repetition. Iran must account for these crimes. The victims and their families must have justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that contribution. And our next speaker is the Honourable John Perry, who is a former Irish minister and is a great friend of the Iranian resistance. John.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here with you today. And first of all, I'd like to compliment my colleague, Jim Higgins, on his wonderful contribution. I think it's very important. It is misguided view the 1988 massacre as historical events. The enforced disappearance are ongoing, and 30 years later, victims' families continue to be tormented by anguish and uncertainty over the fate of their loved ones. These are the words of Mr. Philip Luther, Middle East and North Africa Research and Advocacy Director at Amnesty International. The massacre of political prisoners, which happened in Iran by the fatwa of Khomeini in 1988, and I believe it briefly explained our view and position on this unimaginable tragic event and shocking crime against humanity. In addition, there is another huge concern, as the National Council of the Resistance of Iran has repeatedly emphasized there's a risk of a new wave of secret mass executions in Iran prisons. If the regime officials and leaders in Tehran continue to enjoy impunity at the international level, despite their well-documented involvement in serious human rights violations and crime against humanity at home, in order to prevent such human rights violations from happening again, it is absolutely necessary to hold the regime in Tehran to account. Needless to say that this is not and will not be done by the judicial system in Iran that is controlled and belongs to the regime itself, and in fact is the very perpetrators of the 1988 massacre that are in charge of it today. On international level, so far, the United Nations has not carried out its long overdue duties in this regard. Therefore, we have to campaign to demand that all democratic governments, in particular the Western governments, do, number one, strongly condemn this heinous crime against humanity and launch their independent investigations and inquiries into, and also take this case to the courts with international jurisdictions, in particular the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and also demand bringing the perpetrators to justice. Number three is implement diplomatic and economic sanctions on the Ayatollah regime, similar to the successful policy of maximum pressure of the United States, as well as call upon the UN for further international sanctions on this regime. Through different resolutions, the bipartisan members of the United States Congress have condemned the human rights violation by the Iranian regime, including the 1998 massacre. It is time that we on this side of the Atlantic, in the EU and the UK, join them in support and send a strong message of solidarity to the people of Iran, and send a strong message of condemnation to the Iranian regime, and make sure they understand that this time we mean business and will not stop till we help the people of Iran and the legitimate resistance, the NCRI, achieve justice. Their ultimate goal of that is the democratic and free Iran. I believe the recent statement called "Listen to the Voice of the Iranian People" that is sponsored by the well over 100 European and Arab parliamentarians to date is a very powerful step in that direction. All Western democracies should take every necessary measure to maintain an arms embargo on the brutal dictatorship of the Ayatollahs in Iran. As always, I will continue to give my full support with this, and with Ireland sitting right at the top table of the UN Security Council at the start of 2021, I promise you that I will do my utmost to work with your many other supporters and friends in Ireland in order to demand that our government will be the voice for the oppressed people of Iran and raised issues of human rights in Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure being with you here today. And I'd like to compliment all of the wonderful speakers, and you can be assured of my continued support and that of my parliamentary colleagues here in Ireland, that we will be a strong voice in support of the many wonderful speakers here today, and that this time next year that we'll have straight talk, there will be action, and there will be results. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Egidijus Vareikis, who is a member of the Lithuanian Parliament and Deputy Chairman of its Foreign Affairs Committee. Egidijus.
Okay, now I think you hear me. So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, sorry for my a little bit later connection to the conference, but I was in the very important meeting of Lithuanian Parliament today. And why it is important? We adopted the resolution how to protect human rights and human dignity in neighboring country Belarus. You probably know what's going on in this country. So we in Lithuania, we understand very well what means to fight for freedom. Myself, I lived under the Soviet occupation for half of my life. So I understand very well what it means. And so I understand very well what thing the Iranian people fighting for freedom. So I'm thank you once more for inviting me to join this conference. It's very important, not only for you, I would say, it's very important for my spirit as well. And of course, I totally support the call made by our speakers today regarding the independent international investigation into the massacre of political prisoners in Iran. From the international community can no longer ignore this massacre, especially as it was documented and highlighted by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Iran almost 3 years ago. Further inaction by the international community and UN member states will not only be betrayal of the victim, but will undermine the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Iran and international human rights law. Well, today we are seeing the result as an emboldened regime steps up the domestic repression. Part of this ongoing crackdown is against peaceful protesters in the country, and is documented in the new report of the Special Rapporteur on Iran to the General Assembly. In this report, the rapporteur expressed shock at the unprecedented use of excessive and lethal force by state security forces during the November 2019 protests, including by the police and so-called Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The report also states that confessions are extracted under the torture have been the basis for conviction and harsh sentences in trial of protesters, including imprisonment and the death family. This shows what the realities on the ground in Iran requires the international community and UN member states to go beyond the international investigation of historic and current human rights abuses by Iran, by Iran's judiciary and the repressive state security forces. And that is why I welcome the initiative of my colleagues in the UK Parliament and in the British Committee for Iran Freedom to initiate a statement in support of the people of Iran. The statement urges governments to back the call by the leader of Iranian resistance in the country does not mean two armies and press the regime in Iran to disband the revolutionary guards and allocate the money otherwise spent on these guards and destructive programs to improve the Iranian people's life. I'm a proud signatory of this statement together with my many cross-party parliamentarians from Europe and Arabic countries, which also call the governments to take every necessary measures to extend and maintain the arms embargo to Iran and reimpose the UN Security Council resolution against the regime. Today, the regime in Iran is a global threat, and thus countering this threat requires a global response, while the final solution lies in the hands of Iranian people and their resistance movement. Therefore, this international response must be an overreaching approach based on fairness and focuses on accountability for the regime leaders in all these areas, from its human rights violations to warmongering terrorism in the region and in Europe, to its pursuit on the illicit and nuclear weapons program. That is what I need the support of what is needed to support Iranian people and their resistance movement to bring about the democratic change in Iran that neutralizes the threats from the regime once for all. I will continue to support them all these efforts because we must unite to work together to hold the regime to account. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Egidius. Before I call the next speaker, who is Roger Lyons, former president of the British Trades Union Congress, can I apologize? Sadly, I've got a select committee starting very shortly, so I have to leave now. But it's been a great pleasure to be here with you today, and I do hope that you enjoy the rest of this conference.
David, so next speaker is Dr. Jocelyn Scott. So if Dr. Jocelyn Scott could kindly speak.
Yeah. Thank you. There comes a time when no one can remain silent. There comes a time when no one should remain silent. And there comes a time when the voices that have been stilled must be resurrected through the voices of the living. There comes a time when the world must listen. There comes a time when the world must act. This time, since the 1988 massacre of political prisoners in Iran, has been every time, every year, every day after that massacre, every week, every month, and every year. The case for international investigation into the 1988 massacre of political prisoners in Iran is clear. It has been made time and time again for 30 years, and now it is made again for the 32nd year. What happened in 1988 was a crime against humanity. This crime was leveled against political prisoners by the Iran regime, a regime that seeks to preserve its own power, whatever the cost to Iran, whatever the cost of Iranian lives, and whatever the cost to legitimate claims for freedom and democracy. A crime against humanity lies in a systemic attack directed against any civilian population. It lies in the massacre, the murder of any civilian population. It lies in the massacre, the murder of Iranian political prisoners in 1988. That 30,000 human beings lost their lives, were killed, were murdered by the Iranian regime is a forceful example of what a country's leaders can do, will do, when they believe that they are above the law, and when that belief is bolstered by the fact that the international community simply stands by. It is a potent example of what can happen when a regime considers it has no obligation to honor and respect the lives of its people, nor any obligation to honor and respect international law. The fatwa by the Ayatollah Khamenei that led thousands of political prisoners, youths, women, and men to be executed between the months of July and August 1988 is on the record. The names of those officials playing a direct role in effecting this fatwa and the murders are known. They are on the record too. The global denial of these executions, as expressed by the Special Representative of the Commission on Human Rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ronaldo Galindo Pol, in January 1989. That is January 1989, 31 years ago. This global denial, a deliberate worldwide ignorance, cannot be allowed to continue. Crimes against humanity, the Iranian massacre of 1988 matters. That the regime that is responsible remains in power in Iran matters. This should no longer go unremarked upon and unrecognized by the international community, nor should this gross lack of action continue. These crimes against humanity must be acted upon. As a barrister and human rights lawyer, as a member of the world community, and as a human being, I endorse the call for an official inquiry into the 1988 massacre. This official inquiry must begin without delay. It must be instituted immediately. Those involved must come before the inquiry. They must be required to speak for themselves as to the crimes that are evidenced by their own words. The silence must be ended. But the matter must not end there. The outcome of the inquiry must be acted upon. Those responsible must be called upon to answer for their crime. It is only by this action that the community, the international community, will begin to atone for its ignorance. Only then will the international community begin to redress the failure to act in the interests of the lives of all Iranians. Only then will the international community take seriously its responsibility to ensure the right of every Iranian to be free and to live in a democracy, to live in a world that takes international law and its application to their country, Iran, seriously. I stand with the Iranians who stand for the right of all Iranians to live in a country where democracy and freedom speak, where democracy and freedom matter. I stand with all who call for an immediate inquiry into the massacre of 1988 of the 30,000 innocent Iranians. Thank you.
Can you unmute Bob, please? It's a black man. Yes. Next speaker is Malcolm Fowler. Mr. Malcolm Fowler.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Go ahead, Malcolm. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, and you can hear me as well. Okay.
Yes, yes, go ahead.
There we are. There we are. We got there. Thank you, Chair Bob. How do you follow all these brilliant speeches? That's my question. The truth is that I echo all of that. I want to share this with you, something I found the other day that's so much on the point I maintain. Martin Luther King said many wonderful and and inspiring things, but one of the most momentous was this: our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Now then, these atrocious crimes against humanity of 1988 matter. They mattered then, they matter today, and they will matter for all our yesterdays. There are those who would still say, this is all history. To them, should there be any need after this powerful testimony today, including from victims and their families, to them I say, 1988 is with us still now. Kirsty Brimelow, my dear friend Sarah Chandler and others have made the point. The atrocities continue as though they were perpetrated yesterday because they are still going on. We know about this from November last year. As we speak, atrocities are being perpetrated. And in all conscience, by law and in all morality, the flames are still being fanned by this vile regime every single minute of every single day. Their fingerprints, and particularly as been said already by Sir Alan Meale and others, these perpetrators enjoy the fruits, very of them corrupt fruits, financial and otherwise, of their high offices still held. We must pursue them. There is evidence aplenty. Many have touched on this already. I'll add only this. The NCRI's own Mohammed Mohaddessin presented the lists of these perpetrators, many of them, to the United Nations Security Council many years ago. As to the justice for victims of the 1988 massacre, I'm proud to say that on behalf of my professional body, the Law Society, I participated early on in that. And Kirsty Brimelow has expanded on all of that in the most brilliant and committed way. Let us not forget, because I'm proud of it, and so should you all be, the Law Society has espoused your cause, our cause, for many years now. And there have been interventions, there have been protests. Sarah herself is still on the Law Society Council. Many past presidents come to your conventions and so on. The fact is, we need a no-holds-barred scrutiny of all that went on. And I say finally this, finally, my friends and colleagues, this: let right be done. It must be done now, and we must remember those resounding words of Martin Luther King. We must live each day to eradicate this injustice, and you have my pledge and the pledge of many others. Thank you so much for giving me the time. I'm always so proud to be able to contribute in a however humble a way.
So the next speaker is Mr. Roger Lyons, the former president of the trade unions. Yes, go ahead, please.
Can you hear me? Thank you for inviting me to this important conference. It's great to be with you and the other prominent speakers today to discuss the alarming deterioration of human rights in Iran and appropriate responses from the UK to address the regime's current and past human rights violations and abuses. As former president of the TUC, I want to alert all trade unions, and I want them to understand the issues and inform their millions of members of the real situation in Iran. The 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners was not only a crime against humanity, but a concentrated campaign planned by the regime in advance to annihilate the opposition and any dissenting views. The mass executions were so vicious and horrendous that the second man in Iran at the time, the supreme leader in waiting, the late Ayatollah Montazeri, protested the executions in letters to Khomeini, the supreme leader at the time. And in the audio recording of a meeting held in 1988 between high-level state officials and clerics, which was published in August 2016, Montazeri addressed these officials who were members of the death committee that oversaw the massacre and said, in my opinion, the greatest crime committed under the Islamic Republic from the beginning of the revolution until now is this crime committed by you, members of the judicial system, in my opinion, the greatest crime committed during the Islamic Republic, for which history will condemn us. Your names will be in future etched in the annals of history as criminals. For his protest and opposition, Montazeri was stripped of his senior position by Khomeini and banned completely from the political arena until his death. In contrast, one of the clerics in that meeting, Raisi, who was heavily involved in carrying out the massacre, is now the head of the judiciary in Iran. And another one, Pourmar Mohammadi, served as the justice minister in Rouhani's cabinet. This clearly shows that the regime in Iran today needs criminal perpetrators and mass murderers like Raisi to hold on to power. It also proves that repression and executions are the foundations of the theocratic rule in Iran. I myself and my wife were possible victims of Iranian plans in June 2018 in Paris and in July 2019 in Albania. Albanian agents tried to destroy the conferences of solidarity. The perpetrators, or the intended perpetrators, are now in jail, and in Brussels the first set are being tried. But this is an example of how state terror has no borders for the Iranian regime. We see at the same time a terrible crackdown on the workers of the Iranian industries. For example, the Haftaper sugar cane workers and the Iranian oil and gas workers have been on nationwide strikes for several weeks to protest unpaid wages, unsafe working environment, and poor living conditions. The strikes taking place in over 12 provinces and is reminiscent of the last months leading up to the downfall of the Shah's dictatorship. So Iranian society is on the verge of an explosion against the ruling regime. The authorities know this better than anyone and are terrified of popular protests. So they are arresting and intimidating the workers who are on strike for demanding their basic rights and wages, similarly as the authorities did when they killed 1,500 after the 2019 November protests. So without international actions and intervention, which the other speakers have called for, there is a risk that the regime's judiciary, led by the mass murderer Raisi, will resort to another campaign of secret mass executions in Iran's prisons to quell the growing popular dissent. The international community cannot allow history to repeat itself in this respect. That's why I believe that the UK, which historically has played a decisive role in human rights matters, should get involved and secure an international investigation into the 1988 massacre and the ongoing crackdown today of protesters and workers. The UK government must demand the immediate release of all political prisoners and arrested protesters, and press the UN to immediately send a fact-finding mission to Iran to visit them and investigate recent reports of torture and other ill treatment. Today, the interests of the UK and the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people converge, and that is why the UK government must stand with the Iranian people and not side with the regime. We must show solidarity. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we have, I think with that speech by Mr. Roger Lyons, we end the conference, and thank you, all of you, for attending this very important conference, and also honorary members of the parliament and prominent jurists and other personalities, and also friends of the Iranian resistance and the Iranian people. We are very grateful to all of you, and thank you so much for attending this important conference. Thank you once again. Have a nice day.